welcome back to Grains in Small Places, and today we're going to be doing biscuits and blondies, and of course with fresh milk flour. So let's get started. So first, we're going to go ahead and start out with our blondies. These aren't just any blondies, these are brown butter blondies, and they are so good, truly chewy and delicious. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and grab my pan so we can start browning the butter. I'm going to use a half a cup of butter, which is, I guess, one stick of butter or 113 grams. Don't worry, I'll go ahead and put a link to the recipe down in the description box below. That way you can print it off and have it for your records, and you don't have to write everything down as I am telling you them. So we want to put it in about medium-high in our pan, and you'll see it'll melt. It'll start to bubble just a little bit. At this point, I'm going to use my Christmas spatula. So you want to stay close by at this point and keep stirring it. It can burn to the bottom easily. It can also start to bubble out of the pan. So whatever pan you choose, make sure to get a pan that is much larger than the amount of butter that you want it to brown. Otherwise, when it starts to foam, it can come out of the pan. So you'll see it start to bubble a little bit. We're still not browned yet. We got to keep going. We got to be a little bit brave here. Try not to burn it. But it'll start to bubble and then it'll start to foam up. And at this point in the game, we need to keep stirring it. And also when it starts foaming, we need to pretty much continuously stir it. Otherwise it will burn. But you can see it's already starting to have just a little bit of a golden hue. But the reason we're doing this is butter has some water in it. So when we start this process, we're actually basically boiling out the water so that what we're left is all butter. And what is the brown part is the butter solids. So here is where it's starting to want to foam up a little bit. And depending on the butter you're using, sometimes it foams worse than others, but keep stirring it. And you will start to see it turn a like brown caramely color. But you will also smell the delicious aroma. It almost has a caramely smell to it, even though there's no sugar in this. Then we want to turn off the heat and pull it off to start cooling. The butter solids have now separated and are browned. The little brown bits in the bottom, you can see here, that's what we're looking for. And this just levels up multiple levels to those blondies or cookies or baked goods or whatever you're making with them. So while the butter is still hot, I'm going to go ahead and put 1.5 cups of brown sugar in here and just kind of mix it around. We don't necessarily want to melt all the brown sugar because we don't want this to be like a hard candy. So that's why I have it off the heat here. But we just want to mix it around so it's all wet and the butter and brown sugar are incorporated. We're going to go ahead and set this to the side, and it smells amazing. and we'll work on milling our flour. So I'm going to get my little scale here, and I like to weigh my wheat berries because once I mill my wheat berries, I know I have that exact amount of flour. We're going to use soft white wheat today. If you don't have soft white wheat, you could try using spelt or einkorn, would probably work pretty nicely. You could use hard white, but it might be a little bit more tough, and you would definitely need less of the flour. So I've got the weight that I want. I'm going to take it over to my mill, and we're just going to go ahead and mill the flour. We're going to turn it on, tighten the stones just a little bit, and pour the wheat berries in. And then we want to tighten the stones just a little bit more after the wheat berries go in. Not so much that the flour stops coming out, but enough that it's making our flour fine. So you can see the flour coming out here. It's kind of enjoyable to watch. All right, now that it's milled, I'm going to go ahead and turn off the mill, put on the lid, and here we have our fresh milled flour. Let's go ahead and preheat our oven to 350 degrees Fahrenheit. And I have my mixer out here. You could probably do this without a mixer, just by hand. I just like to do this so I can move the butter and sugar around a little bit. I don't get quite creamed butter and sugar because the butter has been melted and browned, and it's still a little bit warm here. So we're just going to put all the sugar into the mixer. We're going to mix the butter and sugar until it's all incorporated. And then add our vanilla. I love to make my own homemade vanilla extract. I have a video on that as well. I can put a link to if you're interested in learning how to make your own homemade vanilla. And since these are blondies, vanilla is the main flavor. A blondie is basically a brownie without the chocolate. You could add chocolate chips in here, or nuts, or even dried fruit, butterscotch chips, peanut butter chips, whatever you want to add for flavoring. But vanilla is the main flavor for blondies. So we want to make sure we put in a decent amount. That's why we're using about 2 teaspoons or so. We're going to mix that in and then add in our eggs. And it's going to take about 2 large eggs. And I want to go ahead and mix those in until they're all incorporated as well. All right, and back to the dry ingredients. Here is that flour that we just milled together. And to the flour, I'm going to go ahead and add our dry ingredients. We want to put our salt and our baking powder, and then just give it a little mix with our fork or a whisk or whatever you want to use, just so it's incorporated and combined. And then we're going to put those dry ingredients right into our wet ingredients. And we want to mix those until they're all combined. Make sure to scrape the sides as needed. That way you won't have anything unmixed in the bottom or on the sides. So now we're going to take, you can either make this in a 9x13 if you want a really thin blondie, or you could make it in an 8x8 if you want a thicker blondie. But either way, you're going to want to either line it with parchment paper or grease it or spray it with cooking spray really well so that it doesn't stick. So today I'm using an 8x8 glass baking dish because my 9x13 was already being used for something else. We'll just pour the entire blondie batter out right into the pan and spread it as evenly as we can. It doesn't have to be perfect as it cooks. It kind of levels itself out a little bit. So originally I wanted to put chocolate chips in the blondies, but as you can see, I will show you, I put the chocolate chips in when the mixture was still way too hot, so that ended up with melting my chocolate chips, but it ended up being a super delicious, nice surprise. Let me show you. So you can see the chocolate chips where it melted and it kind of left like a little swirl. It's sort of like in between a brownie and a blondie, and I feel like this recipe deserves to be noticed rather than throw it away and stick with just blondies. So if you like chocolate and you want to add chocolate chips, that is a great option. But if you love chocolate and you want to melt the chocolate chips in with the sugar and the butter, it's a new dessert. Okay, and the blondies are done and it smells incredible in here. You want to make sure that you let them cool. Now I'm showing you this has already been cooling for about an hour and it's still a little bit warm in the inside still. So you want to let it cool all the way until you cut it. If it looks a little bit loose when you pull it out of the oven, that's pretty normal. It will set up as it cools down. To let it cool a little bit quicker, if you take the whole baking pan and just set it on top of a wire rack, that way cool air can go underneath the baking vessel. That helps cool it a little bit faster, but make sure you allow yourself at least an hour, if not 2 hours, to cool. And to save these for the next day, I just put a little bit of saran wrap on the top or cover them and leave them out on room temperature. And let me tell you, the next day, the flavors intensified even more. They were so good. And these were truly chewy. And I'm not joking when I say chewy blondies. These were not cake-like, like some recipes that I've tried before. I like cake, but if I want cake, I want to make cake. So these were really that chewy texture that you are looking for when you want that chewy blondie. So one key is to make sure you're using real butter. You cannot use margarine here. Now on to the biscuits. So to get started on our biscuits, I'm going to go ahead and take some whole milk. I'm going to use about 1 1/4 cup. I have all the weights in the recipe linked in the description box below, weights and volume and all of that. And I'm going to take some vinegar and I'm going to add a tablespoon of vinegar to my milk. This is kind of essentially making a buttermilk substitute. Now, if you want to use buttermilk, go for it because it probably will be even better than mine. But I didn't have any and I want to show it still can be made. They're still delicious and wonderful with this combination. So I'm going to let that milk and vinegar sit. It'll start to curdle. That's normal. Then we're going to weigh out our wheat berries. I'm using soft white wheat here. You definitely want to use a soft wheat when you're making biscuits. It helps give that tender, flaky crumb. If you're using hard wheat, it is a little bit difficult to get that soft biscuit. Once I have the wheat berries weighed out to the amount that I want, I'm going to take it over to my mill and we will mill it into a fine flour. I really love these everyday grain bins. They are just wonderful. I can put a link to those below if you're interested, along with anything else. And again here, we're just going to turn on our mill, tighten it just a little bit, pour in our wheat berries, and then tighten it just a little bit more. And now our flour is done. Obviously, it takes a little bit longer than that. I cut it out so you didn't just have to see the mill working, but it really only takes a couple minutes. Now I'm going to also mill just a little bit extra of the soft white wheat flour so that I have this for my dusting surface. I don't know, I probably used about a quarter cup of wheat berries, which yielded me about a half a cup of the actual flour that I could use for the dusting surface. I guess about that much. This one doesn't have to be exact. So to my bowl of fresh milled soft white wheat flour, I'm going to add the dry ingredients. Now this is a special ingredient. This is potato starch. You can use cornstarch, but this potato starch really helps lighten our flour almost into a pastry type flour. But we're also going to add a tablespoon of baking powder, a teaspoon of baking soda, a teaspoon of salt, and 1/8 a cup of sugar. Sugar's kind of one of those secret ingredients. It's not going to make the biscuits sweet like a dessert, but it just kind of amplifies the flavor. And this is my little pastry cutter that I'm going to use. Let's take this over to my table. I'm going to use 2 sticks of butter, which is 1 cup of butter. This is cold butter. I'm just gonna cut it into rough chop pieces, I guess. You can cube it nicely if you want, but we're going to cut it in with our pastry cutter here in a little bit. If you don't have a pastry cutter, you could use a fork to do this. You could use 2 butter knives. However, you can cut it into the flour. Some people will use a food processor, whatever way you want to do it. It's kind of similar to when you make pie dough. But today I'm going to use my pastry cutter. I picked it up for like $4, I think. And I want to bake this in my cast iron pan. So let's just cut up these butter into just rough chopped pieces, and then I will put them in the flour. Making biscuits out of fresh milled flour is no easy task. I think a lot of people can tell you that. I have been working on a biscuit recipe for years that was perfect. Every time I alter it a little more, I make my little chicken scratch notes on the sides. And this recipe, spoiler alert, I was so happy with. And I have made a lot of biscuit recipes. Some of them were almost inedible. So I decided I need to kind of venture off and do a little bit of test kitchen and figure out the best recipe for these buttery biscuits. And let me tell you, they do not disappoint. And my sister taught me I could save these little papers from the butter and use them to actually grease my pan with. So I'm using these on my cast iron pan here just to put a little bit of butter on the bottom. It doesn't have to be drenched or doused with butter, but it ends up helping brown the bottoms of the biscuits, and so obviously we don't want them to stick either. So that was a great tip. Thanks, sis. So we're going to use the pastry cutter, and I'm just going to keep kind of pushing down and rocking back and forth because it has like a rocking horse style bottom. It's rounded if you've never used one before, which kind of matches the round of my bowl. And I just want to keep cutting the butter into smaller pieces as I work the flour around. Now, sometimes you'll have to clean off your little pastry cutter here because it gets gunked up with a bunch of butter and flour. So just kind of scrape it off occasionally. Obviously, it's going to keep happening, so you don't have to keep scraping it off. But if you're noticing that the butter's not cutting and it's just mushing, you may have to mix that up. But you can see these pieces, these are still way too big, so we want to keep cutting them smaller and smaller. And while we're cutting, we also want to pull in from the sides some of that flour that's not getting incorporated so that we can make sure the butter and flour are evenly distributed throughout each other, because we want to make sure that all the flour gets some little butter bits in them. So you don't want to incorporate this till it's all smooth. You still want chunks of butter in here. You can see I've got some a little bit larger than others. Most of them are pea size, but I do have a few in here that are a little bit larger than that, and I'm okay with that. I actually like to have these little bits of butter still in here. So what I'm going to do is take our little milk mixture here, and yes, it's a little chunky, and as I said before, you could use buttermilk if you prefer, but I'm going to make a little well in the flour and pour most of my milk mixture into that well and then begin mixing. You can use a fork, you can use your hand, a Danish dough whisk, whichever you prefer to use here. I'm just going to use the fork that I've already had sitting here in the beginning, and then I like to get my hands in the dough. I think you guys all know that by now already. So I'm going to mix that around until most of it's all incorporated. There's no visible milk left, and I'm going to pour the rest of this milk just wherever there's dry flour left. Fresh milled flour will continue to absorb. It takes longer to absorb than regular flour, so this may look like a little bit of a wetter dough than what you would make if you were making biscuits with just regular white flour or the lily flour. But it does take a little bit longer to absorb this liquid. So we want a wet dough, but we don't want it so wet and soupy. If it ends up being way too wet and soupy, you want to add a little bit of that extra flour that you milled. If it's too dry, you may need to add just a hair more of the milk into this. You can see kind of the texture I'm working with here. It's just a nice dough that's not overly sticky, but also not super dry. And you can still see some of these larger chunks of butter. I could have cut them up smaller, but I don't know. I kind of like seeing them. I'll show you what they look like when we actually make the biscuits. So now we're going to cover this, and I'm popping it in the fridge for about 15 minutes. Now, if you want to make these the night before, put them in the fridge at this point and then finish this recipe tomorrow. These can sit in the fridge overnight without any issue. And we're going to preheat our oven. So if you want to make some biscuits early in the morning and you don't want to have to go through all of the beginning steps or turn the mill on or make any loud noises in your kitchen, you can definitely do that the night before and then just cut them out in the morning. So I'm going to lightly flour with that extra flour that we milled my work surface. This little mat is super handy. I thank you for that gift very much. You know who you are. I just think it's really helpful for making certain things. I don't love it for kneading bread, but other than that, it is great for any cutting or anything like that. So we are going to lightly knead this. Now I know most biscuit recipes say don't knead your dough at all, but with fresh milled flour, we need to just a little bit. I don't want to over knead it. I don't want to knead it for 10 minutes. Just a few turns here and there so that it's incorporated and it's not all crumbly and falling apart. We don't, all the cracks and stuff like that. Just use a little bit of flour as needed. Do not overly flour this or you'll end up with a super dry mess. So you can use a rolling pin here. It's probably better to use a rolling pin. Mine was dirty, so I'm using my hands. I went ahead and just flattened this. I'm going to say probably about a ½ inch, but you can already see those chunks of butter in there. I think that helps make the biscuits really flaky, buttery, and delicious. I'm going to push it to about a ½ inch thick and just lightly, very lightly flour the top of this. I don't want it to be super heavy flour or else we will have issues with our biscuits staying together. But I'm going to push it down with that flour, and then I'm going to take my pastry cutter and I'm going to cut this little circle in half. But I want to make sure that it's not stuck to the bottom of my mat before I do this, because otherwise we'll have issues. So I'm just going to flip it over here and we're going to cut it in half. You can see the thickness of my cutter here. That's about half of that is what I want from the thickness of my dough. maybe slightly more than half. But I'm going to take the half that we cut in half and put it on top of the other one. I want the flour side down here so that the side that we had lightly dusted, remember we flipped the dough, is touching the top. Now we're going to gently press this down. You don't want to press it till it's flattened. You just want to just kind of slightly adhere the two pieces of dough together. And I'm checking my thickness with my cutter here so that I can see how thick I want it to be. I want it to be about the height of the cutter or even slightly larger than the cutter is fine. You want to make sure to dip that cutter into some flour so it doesn't stick. Now when you push it in, just push straight down and pull the biscuit out. You don't really want to do any twisting motions because that can seal in and make the biscuits less likely to rise. Now you can still get a rise if you twist it. It's okay. It's not a big deal, but it just is helpful if you can just resist the urge and just push it straight down. But you can see those little butter bits. That gives us such a wonderful flavor. So I'm going to do this all the way around until I can't cut any more out because they won't fit. And then we will reconfigure our dough. So to do that, we're just going to pull it all back together. Just give it a couple little kneads so that there's not cracks and crevices throughout the whole dough. We're going to lightly flour our surface again and then flatten it out. And basically we're going to repeat those same steps. So we're going to flatten it out to about a ½ inch or so thick. And I like to use my little cutter here to guide all the way around so I can make sure we're accurate. And again, you can use a rolling pin if you prefer. I don't know. I like to use my hands, and the less dishes dirty, the better. So we're going to do the same thing. Cut it in half, and we're going to put the flour sides together. This bottom here is too floury to put against the other dough. So I'm putting the lightly floured side against the other lightly floured side. We're going to smash that down or roll it until it's about the thickness of our cutter or maybe a little bit thicker. Same thing. We're going to dip it into the flour and cut those out, and we're just going to repeat this process until we are out of dough, basically. I made about 11 biscuits here. Don't forget, the last biscuit you make is always a little bit wonky, but I say that's just, a taste tester for the cook. So I usually will just squash it down into my biscuit cutter with the little bits of dough that I have left, and sometimes it looks better than others, but you get what you get with that last piece. I mean, why throw it away, right? I got these all in this pan. Of course, you could use a baking sheet. Just line it with some parchment paper. Your baking times might be on the lower end, whereas the cast iron, the baking times are normally on the higher end. My pan may be a little bit crowded here, but I don't want to throw any dough away, and I also don't want to have to redo another batch. So they're going into the oven. And 450 degrees for somewhere between 15 and 20 minutes. And towards the end of their baking time, I just melted some butter, about 2 tablespoons of butter, in the microwave so that they would be ready to brush the tops of the biscuits as they come out of the oven. And why not add just a little bit more butter, right? So here they are. You can see the flakiness. You can see the levels and how they've risen. I'll try to take some out to show you, but we want to brush this all over. That was the biscuit that we kind of did last that was a little bit on the wonky side, but actually it turned out pretty good. It does have some cracks in the top just because the dough had already started to dry out a little more. But they are crispy at the top, and I'll show you the inside here in a little bit. I'm just going over them one more time because I have butter left, so why not? So here's our biscuit, and I'm just going to kind of pull it in half here. It's still steaming. I don't know if you can see all the steam there, but it's still hot, you can see. So nothing better than just a hot, fresh biscuit. I went ahead and put some butter on here and honey, and oh my goodness, these were incredible. They were the best biscuits I have ever had. And I have made a lot of biscuit recipes. Thanks for hanging out with me today while we made our biscuits and blondies. Don't forget to check out my blog at grainsandsmallplaces.net. You can find both of these recipes and a whole bunch of other recipes, all fresh milled flour. So thanks for stopping by Grains and Small Places. Goodbye.